In today's day and age, it seems like the Nintendo 64 is going through a bit of a nostalgia period where people are starting to like it a little bit more than a friend, and it's easy to understand why. I mean, the NES and Super Nintendo got their own mini-consoles and have games featured on the Nintendo Switch's online service, so it's only natural for anticipation to start building for the 64 since the perception seems to be that it's next in line. I mean, I kinda think the Game Boy is gonna come first since it's easier to emulate, but that's neither here nor there. But aside from being the next home console Nintendo's gonna show retro love towards, the other reason why one would love this console so much is because it had assloads and assloads of great games, many of which still hold up to this day, which is saying a lot considering how new 3D gaming was at the time. However, despite all the classic 64 games that we all know and love, there were a good handful of others that never saw the light of day, whether it be because they were moved over to another console, got canceled altogether, or unfortunately failed one too many drug tests. I'm not gonna say any names, but Metroid 64, we're all looking at you. You might think it's no use dwelling on what could have been, but for all we know, a hardcore Nintendo 64 fan might come across the gemstone of Kromdar that grants 5 wishes. And should this unlikely but not impossible scenario happen, and he might want to wish for 5 canceled Nintendo 64 games to finally be finished. So in preparation, I think it's best that somebody needs to set the record straight and determine which 5 canceled games need to be prioritized and which 5 need to stay dead. So sit back in your favorite YouTube viewing chair, pour yourself a tall glass of freshly squeezed bull milk, press the subscribe button if you haven't already, and allow me, the world's second most popular prune farmer, Cameron all one word, to tell you the 5 best and 5 worst canceled Nintendo 64 games that I know of. Number 5 best, Super Mario RPG 2. Yeah, I know that what was originally planned as a Square Enix-developed sequel to Super Mario RPG eventually turned into Paper Mario 64. And you know, who's really to say which game would have been better, but whether or not these two games could have coexisted at the same time, I still think it's weird that a game as great as Super Mario RPG never had any kind of follow-up after the Super Nintendo. Especially since Square and Nintendo were back to smoking cigarettes behind Kmart together again. I mean, I love Paper Mario, so I'm not complaining with what we got, which is why the game's so low on the list, but it's still not the same thing as what was originally planned, and I see that as a missed opportunity. Number 5 worst, Cat Roots. What's Cat Roots, you ask? Well, judging by the only known footage of the second-party Nintendo game from E3 2000, it would appear to be some kind of Tom and Jerry, Richie and Scratchy type of game. But aside from that, nobody seems to have any idea, and when I say nobody, I mean nobody. Not even Nintendo employees who were working at the stand had any idea what this game was all about when people asked them. It's almost as if someone switched the footage out as a prank or something.
What the hell is this?
Well, you said this is your sitcom with a sci-fi horror twist. That's never been done before.
Yeah, I know.
At any rate, though, while we don't know for sure that this game would have been bad, my butt tells me that it ended up being canceled for a reason. Number 4 best, Dinosaur Planet. I've never actually played Star Fox Adventures on the GameCube enough to really say whether or not it's good one way or another, but even if you loved that game, it's still not what Rare originally intended. The true game that they had in mind was Dinosaur Planet, which was supposed to be the final game on the 64, but then Nintendo took a look at it and said, yeah, this looks pretty cool, I guess, but wouldn't it be way better if it was a Star Fox game? To which Rare respectfully disagreed, only to get bullied into caving so that Microsoft wouldn't be able to include it in a Rare Replay compilation someday. There's really no way of knowing whether or not Dinosaur Planet would have actually been better than Star Fox Adventures, but the consensus seems to be that a lot of stuff had to get sacrificed in order to squeeze Fox and the rest of the gang into an entirely new genre. At the end of the day, though, I think I'd take my chances and sacrifice a Star Fox game that had a mixed reception for a Rare game developed for the Nintendo 64 that came from the heart. Number 4 worst, Contra Spirits. Apparently the Nintendo 64 was supposed to get an exclusive Contra game, which does sound awesome on paper if you're thinking about what the series did in the 8 and 16-bit era, but when you look at what Contra became in the 3D era, I think it's probably best we have one less underwhelming experience to remember. Apparently this was supposed to be a side-scrolling game with occasional 3D sections, as opposed to the Contra game on the PS1 that was just straight-up 3D the whole way through. But for whatever reason, Konami could never get the series back on track after the Genesis and Super Nintendo, except for Contra 4 on the DS, which is probably my favorite game in the entire series. Maybe things would have been different if Konami didn't cancel Spirits due to the 64 not letting the world on fire, but if you ask my vitamin F deficient ass, I seriously doubt it. Number 3 best, 12 Tales Conquer 64. In case you have no idea what I'm talking about, 12 Tales Conquer 64, aka Conquer 12 Tales, was what eventually became Conquer's Bad Fur Day, but the big difference with this game is that it was meant to be a family-friendly depiction of Conquer like we saw in Pocket Tales and Diddy Kong Racing. And don't get me wrong, I'm glad we got the Bad Fur Day we all know and love, and I know a lot of elements from 12 Tales were carried over into Bad Fur Day, but there was still a lot that got left behind, like a bigger overworld, extra bosses, and the ability to play as Barry, which focused more on strategy than platforming. And the fact that 12 Tales is pretty much finished makes it feel like a complete waste that we never got to play it. Apparently there's at least one prototype cartridge that exists, but the guy who supposedly owned it, Richard Weiner of Bathgate, Scotland, died in 2011, and then the game was sold to some butthole who won't let anyone dump the ROM. Some might say that owning a rare game doesn't mean you have an obligation to share the ROM with the rest of the world, but you could say the exact same thing about cake on your birthday, but in both cases, you've got to be a pretty big dickhead to keep it all to yourself. I mean, at the very least, you could charge money to dump a ROM or upload a gameplay video just to let the world know that a prototype exists, but who even knows? Maybe none of this is true when a cartridge isn't even out there, but based on this 30-minute gameplay video on YouTube, I'd wager that we're missing out on a pretty good game. And you know what? I think it's a damn shame knowing there's a 3D platformer made by Rare on the Nintendo 64 that we might never even get a chance to play. Even if what we did end up getting is almost certainly better. Number 3 worst. Rika. Apparently the 64 exclusive was meant to be Nintendo's very own Tomb Raider, and to be honest, it really doesn't look all that bad, but while I might be wrong, I'm pretty sure most knockoffs or clones never reach the same heights as whatever they're copying. And if you look at the portfolio of Bit Studios, I think it's safe to say that this game probably would have been the above-ground pool version of the pixelated babe adventure genre. And for whatever it's worth, the main character's not even wearing clothes that let you peek at her cans, which is half the reason why people even bought Tomb Raider in the first place. I mean, that's why I wanted those games at least. I had no idea how to actually play them. Just don't let my beautiful wife Chili know I said that, though. Number 2 best. Earthbound 64, aka Mother 364. As I mentioned in a previous video, I don't think Earthbound 64 is ever going to come out since it really wasn't all that close to being finished, and since the series doesn't necessarily need to be in 3D in the first place, I think the game we eventually got was probably just as good, if not better. But you know what, that doesn't mean that Mother 3 wouldn't have been great on the 64 had they finished it, especially since the 64 was lacking so hard in the RPG department. The furthest this game ever made it was in the form of a playable demo that was only seen in the barren wasteland of lost Nintendo games known as Space World, and I think it'd be pretty lame if that demo was just gone from existence, but now I guess I'm getting a little off topic here. At the end of the day, we ended up getting Mother 3, so it really doesn't matter, but I'd be lying if I said that the 64 version still wouldn't have been cool, even if for entirely different reasons than the Game Boy Advance. Number 2 worst. Desert Island 64. There were a lot of gaming genres absent on the N64, and one of them happened to be in the simulation genre, which wasn't necessarily everybody's cup of tea, but apparently there were plans for a desert island simulator for the plagued 64DD that gives me Animal Crossing vibes based on the few screenshots that exist. But as promising as that sounds, though, the problem is that this game was actually developed by the same people who made Quest 64. So if I had to bet this month's child support payment, then I'd be pretty confident in presuming that this game would have been a pile of poopy. Number 1 best. Super Mario 64 2. What could I say? Sometimes the most obvious answer is also the best one, and while I wasn't honestly the biggest Mario 64 fan back in the day, I have no doubts that the cancelled Mario 64 2 would have blown the original out of the water, just like how Mario 3 blew Mario 1 out of the water on the NES. Yeah, I know the Japanese Mario 2 sucked horse eggs, but even Nintendo admitted they didn't try with that game, and while Doki Doki Panic, aka Super Mario USA, was a great game, it was still completely different, and any sane person knows that Mario 3 was the true sequel to the original, so zip it, toots. Obviously, Mario 64 ended up getting a sequel on the GameCube called Mario Sunshine, which I've always loved, but it's clearly not the same game Mario 64 2, aka Mario 128, was supposed to be, since it was mostly centered around Flood the Water Cannon rather than just Mario's cute little ass. And apparently Luigi was supposed to be playable too, for whatever it's worth. I suppose you could argue that the underrated Super Mario 64 DS was the true Mario 64 2, but even though that game definitely added a lot, it was a lot closer to Mario 64 1.5 than a Mario 64 2. All I know is that if the original Mario 64 was as great of a game as it was on Nintendo's first try at a 64 game, then just imagine how much better it would have been with a few more years of experience. Probably a lot better than my Mario 64 sequel, I'll tell you that much. Number 1 worst. Quest 64 2. Pretty much everyone hated Quest 64, but since it was one of the only RPGs on the console, a fair amount of people ended up picking it up hoping for the best when they saw how much fun PS1 owners were having with the same genre. And unfortunately, this game probably left a bad taste for RPGs in the mouths of a lot of people, but even so, the developer Imagineer didn't really have a whole lot else going on, and since Quest was the closest thing they had to a hit, that meant that they were going to try to pump another one out. But even though I'm sure the sequel would have probably been an ass hair better, I don't think very many people would have fallen for the same trap twice, so thankfully the cancellation saved the developers some time and spared humanity from another one of these shit-stained games floating around out there. But anyway, that's my list. I know some of you might be disappointed that I left out notable canceled games like Resident Evil 0, Eternal Darkness, or Final Fantasy VII, but at the end of the day, those games eventually came out, and I'd argue that they ended up being better on other consoles, unlike the other games in this video that I mentioned that would have at least been drastically different and possibly even better than what they ended up becoming. And look, I know there's much worse canceled 64 games than the ones I mentioned in the video, but for the most part, I tried including titles that were notable or interesting, rather than something random like Quest for Camelot, which obviously would have sucked. I mean, after all, it's not like we'd have to worry about someone wasting a wish on a game like that. So with that in mind, let me know which canceled 64 games you would like to see become a thing, and which ones you're glad got canceled in the comments below, and as always, I'll try my goddamnedest to respond to everybody. But let me tell you, if there's 2 canceled Nintendo 69 games that need to be resurrected, then it would definitely be today's patrons of the day, Epic Gamer Noob and the Beholder. If you want to be badasses like these two, then consider supporting FU Game Crew on Patreon for loot boxes in the mail and other wacky rewards. And if you want to make a cameo, then send pictures or videos of you rocking any FU Game Crew merch like these legendary human beings you see before you. As always, like and share this video anywhere on the internet to help this channel grow. And if you want to prove that you're not down with registered sex offenders, then go ahead and press the subscribe button if you haven't already. My name's Cameron, all one word, and I'll be back with more videos soon.
So I want to say thank you to your loyalty, thank you for your support.